My brother spent $500K of loans on yachts while I changed our father's diapers. When Dad died, I inherited everything, and now I'm releasing the recordings that will destroy his life. I am the safety daughter. In every family like mine, there is a designated martyr, the one who stays while the others fly. For 5 years, my world was measured in milligrams of morphine, the temperature of lukewarm soup, and the rhythmic, labored breathing of a man who was slowly forgetting my name. I was 31 years old, but I felt 60. My friends were getting married, traveling to Europe, and reaching the peaks of their careers. I was learning how to change a catheter without looking at my father's eyes, trying to preserve the last shred of his dignity. My brother Julian was the yacht club son. He didn't just leave. He vanished into a cloud of expensive cologne and business opportunities in Miami. He was the golden boy, the one my father talked about with a sparkle in his eye even on his worst days. Every few months, Julian would call, his voice booming with a confidence that felt like an insult. He'd talk about his disruptive tech startup or his consulting firm, but the conversation always ended the same way. He needed a bridge loan. Our father, despite his fading mind, would always find the strength to sign the checks. He was funding a lifestyle he would never see, for a son who wouldn't even come home for Christmas. I was the floorboards, the thing he stepped on every day without a thought. Julian was the chandelier, the expensive, fragile thing he admired from afar. Julian's life was a curated masterpiece of high-end deception. On social media, he was a god of the South Beach scene. He posted photos from the decks of yachts he didn't own, wearing watches that cost more than my annual salary as a junior architect, a career I had to put on hold to become a full-time nurse. He had this way of making his absence feel like a sacrifice, as if he were out in the world building a legacy for the family. In reality, he was a financial vampire. I watched the bank statements with a growing sense of dread. $15,000 for initial branding, $25,000 for office space. The money was hemorrhaging from our father's retirement accounts, flowing directly into Julian's cocktail parties and luxury car leases. When I tried to bring it up, Dad would shut down. He's a man of action, Claire. He's like I was at his age. You're just like your mother. You worry about the pennies. While the pounds are being made, it was a slap in the face. I was the one managing the pennies to make sure the property taxes were paid and the roof didn't leak. I was the one who saw the panic in Dad's eyes when he couldn't remember where he put his glasses. Julian was just a voice on a speakerphone, a ghost who only materialized when the well started to run dry. By the 3rd year, the man who had built a real estate empire was reduced to a frightened child. The dementia was like a rising tide, slowly drowning the parts of him that made him my father. He started having lucid rages. He would scream at me for stealing his shoes, or accuse me of being an intruder in his home. It was soul-crushing. I would spend hours sitting in the hallway, crying quietly so he wouldn't hear me, feeling the walls of the house closing in. I had become a ghost in my own life. I stopped seeing friends because I couldn't explain the smell of bleach and old age that seemed to cling to my skin. I stopped dating because who wants to be with a woman whose Friday night consists of pureeing carrots and checking for bed sores? Julian, meanwhile, was at a gala in the Hamptons. He sent a photo of himself with a minor celebrity captioned, "Family is everything." I showed it to Dad. He didn't even recognize Julian's face that day, but he smiled at the bright colors of the gala. I realized then that I wasn't just a caregiver. I was a witness to a tragedy that the star of the family didn't even care to attend. The abuse started, getting specific during the 4th year. Dad's lucid moments became rarer, and when they happened, they were often filled with a strange, directed venom. He'd tell me I was a failure because I wasn't married, or that I was leeching off him because I lived in his house, completely ignoring the fact that I had spent my entire savings on his private care when insurance wouldn't cover it. One night, after a particularly brutal session where he told me he wished I had been the one to leave instead of Julian, I bought a small, high-quality digital recorder. I told myself it was for the doctors, so they could hear the personality shifts for his medication adjustments. But deep down, I knew it was for my own sanity. I needed proof that I wasn't the monster he said I was. I needed to hear the words later, in the cold light of day, to analyze if I was actually doing something wrong. That first recording was 10 minutes of him calling me, ungrateful and plain. I listened to it until my ears rang. It was the beginning of my digital archive, the secret history of the Keo, safety daughter. As Dad's health took a final sharp dive, Julian's calls became more desperate. The tech startup had clearly failed, though he would never admit it. Now it was a real estate syndicate. He needed $50,000 for a deposit on a sure thing. I started recording the phone calls too. I would put the recorder next to the speakerphone and watch the levels jump. I heard Julian's voice shift from the smooth, charming son to a cold-blooded predator. When Dad would get confused and ask why he needed more money, Julian would lose his temper. "Because I'm the only one who can save this family's name, Dad. Do you want Claire to be the one in charge?" Marge. She's a servant. She has zero vision. Give me the money or I'm done with you. I won't come to the funeral. I stood there, holding Dad's hand, feeling him tremble as his favorite child threatened to abandon him in death. It was the most disgusting thing I had ever witnessed. I kept the files on a hidden cloud drive, encrypted and double-backed. I didn't have a plan yet, but I knew I was holding a loaded gun. The end didn't come with a bang or a dramatic speech. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day where the sky is a flat, unmoving gray. Dad had been quiet for 3 days, barely eating, staring at the ceiling with eyes that seemed to be looking at another world. I was sitting by his bed, reading a book I hadn't turned a page of in an hour. Suddenly, he reached out and gripped my wrist with surprising strength. He looked at me, and for a split second, the fog cleared. The man I remembered from my childhood, the sharp, capable, stern man, was back. "Claire," he whispered, his voice like dry leaves. "You stayed. You were the only one who stayed." He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't say he loved me, but in that one sentence, he acknowledged the 5-year prison sentence I had served for him. He died 2 hours later, while I was in the kitchen making a cup of tea I would never drink. I didn't cry. I just felt a strange, cold peace. I called the funeral home, then I called Julian. I expected Julian to be devastated, or at least to pretend to be. Instead, when I told him Dad was gone, there was a long silence on the other end of the line, followed by a sharp intake of breath. "Did he sign the deed?" he asked. Not "when did it happen?" or "are you okay?" Just the deed. He was talking about the beach house in Outer Banks, a property that had been in our family for generations. I felt a surge of cold fury. "The body isn't even cold, Julian," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm not talking about property right now," he scoffed. "Don't be dramatic, Claire. We both know how this works. I need to know my position. I'll be there for the funeral, but I'm bringing my lawyer. Don't touch anything in that house." He hung up. I sat in the darkened living room of the house I had maintained, alone for 5 years, and realized that Julian wasn't coming home to mourn. He was coming home to harvest. Julian arrived at the funeral like he was walking a red carpet. He was wearing a black suit that looked like it cost more than the casket. He spent the entire service working the room, shaking hands with Dad's old business associates, playing the part of the grieving, successful heir. He gave a eulogy that was a masterclass in fiction. He talked about the lessons my father taught me about ambition, and our long weekend chats about the future. I sat in the front row, a black veil over my face, listening to him describe a relationship that never existed. He didn't mention the diapers. He didn't mention the 2 a.m. hallucinations. He didn't mention that he hadn't seen our father in person for over 18 months. The people in the pews were dabbing their eyes, looking at him with admiration. They looked at me with pity, the plain, quiet sister who lived at home. Julian was the star. I was just the background noise. I clutched the digital recorder in my pocket, feeling its weight like a secret weapon. 2 days after the funeral, we gathered in the wood-paneled office of Mr. Henderson, the family lawyer. Julian sat with one leg crossed over the other, checking his gold watch every few minutes. He looked like he was at a board meeting he was too important to attend. "Look, Henderson," Julian said, his voice dripping with false boredom. "We all know what the deal is. Claire gets a nice stipend for her service, then I take over the estates in the firm. Let's just sign the papers. I have a flight to Nassau at 6. Mr. Henderson didn't look up. He slowly put on his reading glasses and opened a thick manila folder. "Julian," he said softly, "your father made some significant changes to his will, approximately 14 months ago. He was very specific about his reasons." Julian's smug expression didn't falter, but I saw his foot stop moving. A tiny crack in the armor. Mr. Henderson began to read, and for the first time in my life, I felt the world tilt in my favor. The beach house to Claire. The investment portfolios to Claire. The primary residence and all its contents to Claire. Julian was left with a single, specific bequest, an envelope containing a detailed accounting of the $542,000 in loans he had taken over the last 5 years. The will stated that these funds were to be considered his full and final inheritance. There was a letter attached, written in Dad's shaky but legible hand. "To my son, who lived like a king on the crumbs of my labor, you have already had your share. To my daughter, who gave me her youth while I gave her nothing but my shadow. This is not a gift, but a debt repaid." Julian's face went from pale to a terrifying bruised purple. The yacht club son was suddenly a pauper in a designer suit. The silence that followed was absolute, until Julian stood up so quickly his chair flipped backward. He slammed his hands on the mahogany desk. "This is fraud," he screamed, his voice cracking. "She did this. She manipulated a senile old man. She's been in that house for years, poisoning him against me." He turned on me, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "What did you do, Claire? Did you withhold his morphine? Did you tell him I was dead? You're a predator! You're a sick, twisted nurse who stole my birthright." He was heaving, spit flying from his lips. I didn't move. I just looked at him with the same clinical detachment. I had used to check Dad's vitals. "I didn't do anything, Julian," I said quietly. "I just stayed." "You're the one who left." He lunged toward me, but Mr. Henderson stepped between us. Julian pointed a finger at me, shaking with rage. "I'm contesting this. I'm going to drag your name through the mud. I'll tell the world you abused him. I'll make sure you end up in a cell, not a mansion." Julian didn't wait for a courtroom. He knew he was losing the legal ground, so he went for my throat. Within 48 hours, he launched a full-scale character assassination on social media. He posted old photos of the two of them from a decade ago, looking happy on a fishing trip. He wrote long, tearful captions about how malicious family members had isolated our father and barred him from visiting. He started a Justice for Dad campaign, painting me as a cold-hearted, greedy safety daughter who had held an old man hostage for a payday. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. My phone started blowing up with messages from distant relatives and former friends. "Claire, how could you? Is it true you didn't let him call Julian?" The local news even picked up the story. I was being branded a monster by the man who had bankrupted our father. I sat in the house, the curtains drawn, watching my reputation burn. The legal paperwork followed the social media storm. Julian officially filed a claim of undue influence and elderly neglect. He found a disgruntled former nurse who had worked for us for exactly 2 weeks before I fired her for stealing Dad's pain medication. Julian had clearly paid her to testify. Her affidavit was a nightmare of lies, claims that I left Dad in soiled linens for hours, that I mocked his confusion, that I kept him in a state of fear. My lawyer, a sharp woman named Sarah, looked at the documents with a grim expression. "Claire, this is a he said, she said nightmare. If a jury sees Julian's polished face and this nurse's expert testimony, they might believe you were the one in control. We need more than just the will. We need proof of Julian's character." I looked at her and felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in years. I reached into my bag and pulled out the encrypted drive. "I have it," I said. "I didn't want a long trial. I wanted to end Julian before he could do any more damage." I decided to leak just one, audio file to the family group chat. It was a recording from 2 years ago. Julian was asking for $30,000 for a new venture. Dad was having a bad day and was crying because he couldn't find his watch. You could hear Julian screaming over the phone, "I don't care about your damn watch, old man. Sign the wire. I'm the only reason people still respect your name. Claire is just a drudge. She'll be there to wipe your face regardless, so give me the money." The chat, which had been full of people attacking me, went dead silent. For 5 minutes, nothing. Then my Aunt Martha typed, "Julian, is that really you?" The crack in his golden boy image had finally appeared. As the recording circulated, Julian's life in Miami began to show its true colors. A local journalist, tipped off by my lawyer, started looking into his startups. It turned out they were nothing but shell companies used to funnel Dad's money into luxury rentals and private parties. Julian wasn't a businessman. He was a professional moocher who had built a brand out of air. The yacht club's son was actually 3 months behind on his slip fees. When the story broke, Julian's investors, mostly people he had scammed with the promise of his father's massive estate, started calling for his head. He was losing his grip on both worlds. He called me at midnight, sounding drunk and desperate. "You think you're so smart, Claire? You think you've won? I'll still take that house. I'll burn it down before I let you have it." I recorded that call, too. The day of Julian's deposition was like watching a snake try to shed its skin in a room full of mirrors. He sat there in a gray suit, looking slightly thinner, his eyes darting around. Under oath, he lied with the practiced ease of a psychopath. He claimed he'd tried to fly home 5 times, but I'd told him the house was under quarantine. He claimed I'd blocked his number for months at a time. My lawyer, Sarah, let him talk. She let him dig a hole so deep he couldn't see the sky. Then she pulled out a laptop. "Julian, we have a series of recorded phone calls from the dates you mentioned. I'd like to play the one from last Christmas." We played the audio of Julian telling Dad he wouldn't come home because the house smells like a hospital and I have a party. At the Versace mansion, Julian's face went white. The court reporter's fingers paused on the keys. Julian tried to pivot. He claimed the recordings were illegal and deepfakes. He went back to the abuse narrative, bringing in the crooked nurse to testify in person. She sat on the stand and lied through her teeth, describing scenes of neglect that never happened. I felt the jury's eyes on me. Some were skeptical, but others looked horrified. I knew I had to use the nuclear file. It wasn't a recording of Dad, it was a recording of Julian talking to his mistress in Miami, bragging about how he was playing the long game and how he'd finally get the old man to kick the bucket so he could sell the shithole family house and move to the Caymans. It was the sound of a son wishing for his father's death. I didn't wait for the lawyers to use the nuclear file. I knew Julian's social media campaign was still working on the general public. I created a video. I didn't use a filter water, and I didn't use music. I just sat in Dad's empty room and showed the reality of caregiving. I showed the mountains of medical supplies, the logs I'd kept of every meal, every bath, every tear. And then at the end, I played 30 seconds of Julian's voice, the part where he called our father a bank account with a heartbeat. I posted it with a simple caption, "This is the cost of staying. This is the cost of leaving." It went viral. 10 million views in 24 hours. The yacht club son became the most hated man on the internet. Despite the public backlash, Julian's legal team pushed for trial. They had no choice. Julian was broke and needed the inheritance to stay out of jail for his own frauds in Miami. The courtroom was packed. My parents' old friends sat on one side looking confused and saddened. Julian's Miami crew was nowhere to be seen. He sat at the defense table, his hair unkempt, looking like a man who was finally realizing the floor had rotted out from under him. My lawyer opened with a simple statement. This is not a case about money. This is a case about who stayed in the dark and who only showed up for the gold. My lawyer called a surprise witness. Our father's former business partner, a man Julian thought had passed away years ago. He had been living quietly in Vermont. He testified that our father had called him 18 months before his death crying. He told me he was scared, the partner said, his voice steady. He said Julian was threatening to never let him see his grandkids that don't even exist, if he didn't sign over the firm. He told me, "Claire is the only one who doesn't want anything but my comfort. I have to protect her." He produced a handwritten letter from Dad, detailing exactly why he was changing the will. It was the ultimate sound mind evidence. Julian took the stand on the third day. He tried to play the grieving son one last time, but he was unraveling. Every question from Sarah felt like a scalpel. She showed the yacht rentals. She showed the designer watches. Was this seed capital, Julian? Or was this just you playing dress up with your father's life savings? Julian broke. He started shouting about how he deserved the life he had, how he was better than the drudge I'd become. "She's a servant," he screamed, pointing at me. "She was born to be a nurse. I was born to be a king." The jury watched in stony, horrified silence as the golden boy finally showed his true, ugly face. The jury didn't even take their full lunch break. They were back in 90 minutes. The will was upheld in its entirety. The claims of undue influence and neglect were dismissed as malicious and fraudulent. Not only did I keep the house and the inheritance, but the judge ordered Julian to pay my legal fees and recommended a criminal investigation into the nurses, testimony for perjury. Julian sat at the table, looking small and hollow. He'd lost the money, the house, and the mask he'd worn his entire life. He was $500,000 in debt to a dead man, and the world finally knew he was a fraud. The fallout for Julian was total. Within a week of the verdict, the Miami district attorney filed charges for the shell companies and investor fraud. Without the inheritance to pay off his debts, his house of cards collapsed. The yacht club revoked his membership. His friends vanished. He was evicted from his South Beach condo. I heard through a cousin that he was living in a cheap motel, trying to sell his fake watches to pay for a public defender. He had become the safety son, but with no one to save him. I stayed in the house. For the first few weeks, it was too quiet. I'd wake up at 3 a.m., thinking I heard Dad's bell or his voice calling for water. I'd walk down the hallway, my heart pounding, only to find an empty room. I realized I was still a safety daughter in my mind. I didn't know how to be anything else. I started by throwing out the smell of bleach. I opened every window, let the fresh air scrub the rooms, and bought a forest of green plants. I was repainting the walls of my life, one stroke at a time. I went back to my firm. My boss, who had kept my position open in spirit, welcomed me back with a hug. I was rusty, and my hands shook a little when I picked up a drafting pen, but it felt like coming home. I started working on a design for a community center for caregivers. A place with sunlight, gardens, and quiet rooms where people could just be. I used a portion of the inheritance to fund it. It was my way of turning the shadow into a garden. I was clearing out the attic when I found a box labeled Claire, Private. Inside were all the things Dad had kept, my drawings from grade school, my high school diploma, a dried flower from my college graduation, and a letter, dated the day I moved back home to care for him. "Claire, I know I am a difficult man. I know I will get worse. I am writing this while I still have my mind, to say I am sorry for what I am about to put you through. You are the better of my children. You are the one with the real strength. Please forgive me for being too proud to say it to your face." I sat on the dusty floor and finally, truly cried a few months later. I hosted a dinner for the family members who had supported me, and even a few who had apologized for believing Julian's lies. We didn't talk about the money. We talked about Dad before the fog. We talked about the man who loved jazz and could build anything with his hands. It felt like the house was finally being filled with something other than resentment. I realized that the inheritance wasn't the house or the money. It was the ability to forgive. The man who didn't know how to love me properly. I received a letter from prison. Julian had been sentenced to 3 years for fraud. It was a long, rambling screed blaming me for everything. He said I'd stolen his destiny. I didn't get angry. I just felt a profound sense of pity. He was still waiting for a chandelier to fall from the ceiling to save him. He didn't understand that destiny is built on the floorboards, not the lights. I didn't reply. I put the letter in the shredder and went back to my garden. I am no longer the safety daughter. I am a woman who is loved, who has a career, and who knows her own worth. I met someone, a man who lost his own mother to the same fog. We don't talk about star power or legacy. We talk about the beauty of a quiet morning and the strength it takes to stay when things get hard. I realized that my stability wasn't a boring trait. It was a superpower. I am the anchor that held firm in the storm. 1 year after the trial, I went to the beach house in the Outer Banks. I sat on the porch, watching the waves roll in, the same waves Dad used to watch when he was young. I pulled out the digital recorder one last time. I found a file I'd missed, a recording of Dad laughing at a joke I'd told him during his final week. It was just a sound, but it was enough. I hit the delete button. I didn't need the recordings anymore. I had the truth, I had the house, and finally I had my life. I walked down to the water, the sand between my toes, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for anyone. I was just me.